Yeah, I thought tonight we could look at some of the fascinating timeless themes that we've just been spinning off of here. And those themes can be found as well in the Christmas Carol. And I just wanted to explore those themes to help. They're so profoundly beautiful in terms of the truth of the beautiful, particularly in its Christian outworking. And I hope it really enriches your Christmas or your Hanukkah and your future Christmases and Hanukkahs with just this amazing and timeless story of God's love for the world as revealed through one of the most unlikely characters imaginable. I have a lovely annotated Christmas Carol. It's annotated. Let's see if I can show you a little bit. Well, just the way I open it up. It's got a lot of engravings from the 19th century. It is a fellow named Michael Patrick Hearn, Hearn, if you're interested. I picked it up at a used bookstore, and it gives you all these wonderful insights into what life was like in the 1840s England. And that's when this book was written, 1843. And so I've really been blessed by this edition. And one of the most interesting things a nugget you want to take away from the Christmas Carol immediately is it was written during a time when Christmas festivals had largely ceased due to the 17th century Puritan influence. Puritans were very suspicious of anything that distracted from a very inner experience of the Holy Spirit. And so the Puritans did not like external outworkings. They thought they were purely artificial, and they'd all be burned up in the end, and they don't have anything to do with eternity. As an Orthodox Christian, I radically disagree with that. I think the whole purpose of, as I just explained, the whole purpose of Christmas is the redemption of the cosmic order, the time-space order, that we as co-creators, as created in the image of God, help manifest in the amazing decorations like that Hannah has in her home of Christmas trees, which is a tree of life restored, right? A Christmas tree is just an image of reality. It has heaven at its very top, usually at the star, and then it comes down like a mountain. And so the very, very top is the cherubim and the seraphim in the heavenly realm. And then it starts to make its way more and more and more physical and tangible and touchable, as it were, down to all the way to the bottom, to the presence where you devour and you consume. And of course, we keep going and going down, the abyss. We don't want to go there. But the point is, the Christmas tree has this beautiful image of reality. And that image of reality is manifested in a redeemed vision of space and time. Nevertheless, it was Charles Dickens who recovered that for England. It had been largely eclipsed by the Puritan movement. And so Dickens, by ornamenting his story with all of these wonderful older Christmas practices that many of his readers heard about from an age gone by, but hadn't really seen, it helped to foster a Christmas renaissance. And so this is why the English author G.K. Chesterton called Dickens the man who saved Christmas. So many of our Christmas traditions that we do today actually come in many respects from the Renaissance that Dickens helped lead. All right, so let's dive in here. And we could even talk. I see you guys are chatting some of the TV or the movie versions. I really love the one with Patrick Stewart. It was a TNT version, and it really sticks to the script. It's really, really good. That's an excellent one. There's so many of them. I love the Albert Finney musical. There's a 1970 musical called Scrooge. Now it changes it a bit, but it's so it'll fit for a musical. And it's just love. Finney is an amazing Ebenezer Scrooge. Just physically the contortions. Well, that we'll get right into that here. All right, so let's dive in and let's see what timeless themes we can catch here with A Christmas Carol. I've got my script here. The first sentence here is so interesting. This is the very first sentence of the story. Now, keep in mind, this is a Christmas story, but the very first sentence is, Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. Marley was dead. Now, think about the bizarre irony there. You're dealing with a story centered on the celebration of a birth. But Dickens starts this story of Christmas shrouded in death. And of course, we're going to see death stalk this story. It's all over. And Dickens makes that absolutely clear in his opening lines. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. So death stalks this story. If you think it through, death is, we're not even just talking all the ghosts that he sees. Of course, we have the issue with Tiny Tim. There's a corpse at the end of the story that Ebenezer is being told he needs to pull the shroud over the face so he could see, or from the face so he could see who it is. Jacob Marley's funeral is the opening scene. Scrooge himself is described in corpse-like imagery. Everything about him suggests skeletal skinniness and constriction and confinement and rigor mortis. And even his home, when we go into his home, it's likened to a funeral parlor by Dickens. Here's how he describes Scrooge. It's an amazing piece of writing. It just gives you a sense of how vivid Charles Dickens is. Oh, he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office during the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Again, you even see sort of this morgue imagery of just this refrigeration. Of course, his assistant Bob Cratchit is freezing in the office because he has the warmth, of the Holy Spirit, whereas Scrooge doesn't feel it all. The cold doesn't faze him because of the coldness of his heart. Who knows what Scrooge did as a living? What was his living? What was his business? Who could put that in the chat? Who remembers? Ooh, did I get you? Mortgages, money lender. He was, in a sense, a debt collector. That's exactly right. You're both correct. He was a debt collector. That's actually what we see him doing in a lot of these adaptations on screen. The first thing we see him doing is he's going out trying to collect his debts. But if you think about that from a biblical vantage point, that's pretty fascinating, isn't it? Right? He's a debt collector, purchasing the bad accounts of creditors and then using the law to confiscate as much as possible from the debtors. But he will soon find out what's the irony of it all, right? He'll soon find out that he's the one who has the unpayable debt. He is the one who is the true debtor. Okay. So again, Dickens sets this up beautifully. The opening scene, it's called A Christmas Carol because he considers this, I think it's 5 staves. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but he considered every sort of act as a play. In the play, he called it a stave, like a Christmas song of celebration and cheer. Again, so bizarre how it begins with death, doesn't it? And then begins with a debt collector who we're finding out is the one who actually has the debt. But we're going to find out what's going on here with the very first stave, and that's when his nephew, Fred, comes into his counting office and cries out, "A Merry Christmas, Uncle, God save you." That's Fred's opening line. Absolutely wonderful. Shows you his vibrance. Again, all of Dickens' characters have so much personality to them. It's an exuberant voice, and it breaks the absolute silence and cold darkness of the counting house. But if you think it through, what did Fred just do there? "A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you." Do you notice that's a prophecy? Fred wishes in the form of a prayer that his uncle will have a Merry Christmas, as by God's grace he will, and that God will save him, as by God's grace he will. So nevertheless, old Scrooge, surprised by Fred interrupting the silence of his morgue there, says the iconic "bah humbug" in response. And despite Scrooge's protest, Fred remains resolute. He wants to invite him for Christmas dinner. "Don't be angry with me, Uncle. Don't be angry with me. Come dine with us tomorrow." So Fred's entrance into the life of Scrooge foreshadows, interestingly enough, the fourfold ghostly visits that Scrooge is going to get later that evening, all of whom will in some way, shape, or form invite Scrooge to God's heavenly banquet. Okay, remember that when you're trying to ask, why would God create us? Well, here you go. You're getting your answer here. You've been created for a heavenly banquet. You've been created to feast and to enjoy and to revel in the life that this infinite eternal being alone can give. Scrooge's response is stunning. Scrooge says to him, "I'd rather be damned to hell." Scrooge would rather go to hell than attend such a feast. Again, very fascinating. We got a prophecy uttered that Scrooge will have a Merry Christmas and he will receive God's salvation. And the response is, "I'd rather go to hell." And so obviously Scrooge's nephew Fred says, "Why? Why won't you come and dine with us?" And Scrooge gives him a very interesting question in return. Scrooge asks, "Why did you get married?" And Fred responded, "Because I fell in love." And Scrooge growled, we're told, "Because you fell in love." And Dickens says he treated it like it was the most ridiculous thing in the world. And then Scrooge says, "Good afternoon, goodbye, leave." So we're getting a window into what's going on with Scrooge. We're getting a window in the fact that Scrooge, somewhere along in his life, rejected love. Love has no part in his life. Lust does, right? Avarice does. He lusts after money and gold and coin and the like. Mammon, as we would say. But love, true, genuine, selfless, self-sacrificial love is gone from his life. We see that happen. We see that affirm when the two church wardens come to his office petitioning for the poor. And Scrooge says, "I wish to be left alone. Go away. I don't want to have anything to do with you." And they say, "Well, if you don't help, many people will die." Or Scrooge says they can go to the workhouses, which was a really yucky thing they had back in the 19th century for people to pay off debts. And they said, these church wardens said, "Well, many people would rather die than go there." And of course, Scrooge responded, "Well, if they're going to die, let them do it quickly and reduce the surplus population." So he wants to be left alone. He cares about no one. He even casts out a little child. We see children coming back into the story, lots and lots. a little child comes to the doorway of his money counting, shall we say, temple, and started singing the song, God rest ye merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay. And Scrooge came out with a ruler and ready to smack the kid, and the kid ran away. But of course, the rest of the hymn we all know is, remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. It describes Scrooge perfectly. And then when Scrooge goes home later on that night, Dickens describes the house as a dark funeral parlor. He actually says you could fit a hearse broadside up the staircase. And then when we see Scrooge go into his bedroom, he locks the door from inside, many bolting. He saw, actually, I forgot to mention this, he saw a vision of his partner, Jacob Marley, who we were introduced to at the beginning, who died 7 years ago that night. He died on Christmas Eve, and he saw a ghoulish image of Jacob Marley on the knocker of his front door as he was opening it up from outside to enter in at late at night. And it was his face saying, Scrooge, Scrooge. And all of a sudden he realized it was just a knocker. I think it was a lion's face on the knocker. But again, that tends to, it tends to ring the theme of the book of Revelation. If you're calling Revelation 3, where Christ says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone were to open that door, I will come in and I will sup with him. I will dine with him. So we're seeing some imagery there that's really quite fascinating. So Scrooge locks the door, but many bolts. He thinks he's secure, but of course he gets an intrusion just like he did from Fred, and it's his old partner Jacob Marley in ghostly form. And some scholars of this story actually think that Jacob Marley here is sort of a play on the ending of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. If you know, in Luke chapter 16, there's the rich man who asks God to send Lazarus, the very poor man who is in Abraham's bosom, we're told. So the rich man is suffering in hell, or Hades technically, and the Lazarus is, and he's eating, and Abraham's bosom is the idea of inclining. You tended to incline when you were eating, in what's called a triclinium in the ancient Greco-Roman world. So he's lying in the presence of Abraham, and so he's in the presence of God in the heavenly abode, and the rich man who's suffering, who's been separated from God because of his unrepentant sin, asks Abraham to send Lazarus to his brothers, to warn them that this could be their fate if they don't repent. And he's told, no, the separation's permanent, and your brothers have Moses and the prophets to listen to. If they don't listen to them, they will not respond, even if one were to come back from the dead. Right? Really powerful statement there. In many ways, Jacob Marley is kind of an inversion of that ending. So in this sense, then, Jacob Marley is sort of the rich man who's allowed himself to go back and warn his brother, Ebenezer, who he calls his soul friend and soul mourner, and they have a very clear fraternal relationship. He's now able to give him that warning. So it's sort of a reimagining of what if that parable had a different ending. And it's also interesting because right before Jacob Marley's ghost comes in, we're told that Scrooge is sitting by the fireplace, and it's illustrated with all the Old Testament scriptures, the law and the prophets, Moses and the prophets. There were Cain and Abel's, we're told, and Pharaoh's daughters and queens of Sheba, and Abraham's and Belshazzar's. They were all what's the word? Not paintings. I'm forgetting but there's brickwork there, and mosaics. That's the word I'm looking for. A mosaic on his fireplace. And so we're seeing, I think, a lot of echoes from Luke 16 here, but a retelling if the rich man were able to kind of go back and warn his brother. It's actually the only time we see Ebenezer being called by that name, Ebenezer. He says, I have procured a chance for you to escape my fate, Ebenezer. So this is something that Jacob Marley implored the powers that be in this magical world, right, of A Christmas Carol. He implored the powers that be, and he was granted the ability to try to get Ebenezer to repent and escape his fate. And Ebenezer is a beautiful Hebrew name. The Lord is my help. And so so we're getting, again, just all of this rich biblical imagery in this scene. And then if you recall the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, like I mentioned, it's not just a parable of somebody asking someone to get sent back to Warner Brothers, but it's a parable that is contrasted between the experience of the rich man who's suffering in Hades and Lazarus, who is reclining and having a scrumptious banquet, right? And even the parable itself, if you think it through, is bookended with banquet motif, because the rich man is described while he was living on earth as one who feasted sumptuously every single day. And then, of course, it's implied in the description of Lazarus reclining at Abraham's side. So once again, we're getting this dining invitation coming into the life of Scrooge, and being told, again, like Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I'll come into him and I will sup with him and he with me. So again, there's this sense of you've been invited to a banquet. You've been invited to a celebratory life, and you're out in the cold. You're out in the dark. And then he's promised a visitation of three spirits. There, I won't get into all the specifics there, but there is some really interesting parallels to Dante's Divine Comedy. If anyone you're familiar with Dante's journey from Purgatorio, from Inferno to Purgatorio to Paradiso, from literally from hell to purgatory to paradise. He's accompanied by three spirits in this process. And so the first spirit, of course, is the ghost of Christmas past. And he shows us the origin of Scrooge's rejection of love. That's, whatever, we're kind of screwed up. We're all screwed up in our own ways, right? And if you think it through, I mean, if I talk a lot about the King's Speech, that wonderful movie with Colin Firth, and the very first meeting he has with his speech therapist to try to help his stammer, the speech therapist asks him, "What's your very first memory in life?" And George, well, he calls him Bertie. Bertie says, who's going to be King George VI? He's like, "What are you talking about? I don't know." And his therapist, Lionel, says, "Well, no one is born with a stutter. We pick it up somewhere. Something happens to us in our childhood to rewire the brain," right? Any of you, we all know this. Any of us who have anxieties, which we all do, it's just the question is which one, right? Any of us who have anxieties, I've got them, believe me. Anyone who has all these kinds of insecurities or angers or whatever it is, we picked it up as a child. And it's funny because Jesus says, woe to him who causes one of these little ones to stumble, because we can often be wounded by adults who probably don't recognize it. Well, here Scrooge is giving us a tremendous psychology, because we find out that Scrooge was abandoned at a school, a boarding school. His father didn't want him around. The school is totally deserted for the Christmas season, except for one solitary child, we're taught. He's been neglected by his friends. He's been totally neglected by his family. And Scrooge comes in by means of the Spirit, and he gets to see his little 7-8-year-old self sitting alone in a cold classroom. And the book says he began to cry. So, wow, I mean, we get this amazing vision of what caused him to reject love. And it's because originally, in some way, shape, or form, love had rejected him. And so you could see the beginning of the coldness of his heart. But because he cried when he saw, you're beginning to see that there's still that flash of humanity inside of him that hasn't died yet. It has that rigor mortis hasn't set in fully. It's still there. There's still a beating heart in there. And then we're treated to one of the most wonderful scenes ever. And that is when his little sister Fan runs into the classroom and greets her brother with so much enthusiasm and so much love. And she says to him, Ebenezer, I've come to bring you home. Home. And Ebenezer said, what? He said, home, you wouldn't believe it, Ebenezer. Father has changed so much. He's so much kinder than he used to be. Home is like heaven now, Ebenezer. And Father spoke so gently to me one dear night that when I was going to bed, I wasn't afraid to ask him once more if you could come home. And he said, yes, yes. The implication is that his wife died giving birth to Ebenezer. So he had this anger towards Ebenezer. That's and the implication too is probably he drank and everything. He seems to have quit, and now home is like heaven. And so Father has sent me to bring you back home. Now you have to let all those themes come together. Home's like heaven. Ebenezer's dear little Caesar, who died very young, we find out later on, obviously. Again, most likely giving birth to Fred, by the way. Home's like heaven, and it's time for you to come home. Isn't that beautiful? Because if you think it through, just as little Fan spoke those words to a 7-year-old little boy, so she's now speaking those words again to a very, very old man. She's telling him, as a little angel sent from heaven, it's time for you to come home. Now, the foretaste of that invitation is anticipated by the Christmas Eve celebration hosted by good old Fezziwig, which is Ebenezer's former employer, one of my favorite characters. I love Fezziwig. And it's at this feast in the midst of all the dances and games and mince pies and ale that we learn of Ebenezer's love, his betrothal to a beautiful young girl named Belle, which means beauty. And we find out later on that he had rejected her because he fell in lust with money and with gain. And she was poor and she brought no wealth to his life. And so the last scene with the ghost of Christmas past that Ebenezer has to relive is when she agreed to release him from their bonds of love, release him from their engagement vows. And Scrooge heard her words. Let me get the exact words because they're so good. I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. So Scrooge used to be a man whose heart could love. And that man has, for the most part, disappeared. And here we see a powerful allusion to the whole notion of evil is what in the Latin we call privatio boni, which is the absence of good. So in this sense, evil's not a thing in of itself. It's rather the perversion or the rotting of a previous good thing. So God is infinite goodness. He creates all that's good. And then what is evil? Evil is the absence of the good, or it's the perversion of the good, or the rotting of the good. So it's like a hole in a shirt. It's not like it's a thing that can exist by itself. It needs something prior in order to exist. It's very parasitic in that sense. So we could see that Ebenezer was once a good and beautiful man who's since been marred beyond all recognitions in many ways, but we could still see the outlines of that original love and goodness. And then we get the arrival, the ghost of Christmas present. And of course, what's he surrounded by? You guys remember that? The ghost of Christmas present, the jovial ghost. And he's surrounded by all kinds of meats and sausages and mince pies and plum pudding. So you can tell I read this annotated Christmas carol. It gives us all the different apples and oranges, and tells us about the delicious steam that filled the chamber. And through this guide, Scrooge is invited subsequently to 2 banquets. The first one's at the Cratchit home of his clerk, Bob Cratchit. And then the second one is at his nephew's Fred's house, who's, of course, the son of Fan. And, in stark contrast to the funerary description of Scrooge's home, the Cratchit home is filled with the bustling activity of mother and children excitedly preparing for Christmas dinner. That's when we meet Tiny Tim, whose diminutive stature really underscores the seemingly insignificant tools that God uses to accomplish his purposes, right? God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. So he uses tiny little cripple, as it were, to show forth his radiance and his glory. And in many respects, though, Tiny Tim could also be seen as a bit of a parallel, sort of a lived out parable of Scrooge's dying and decaying moral and spiritual blindness. So what's happening to him physically, in that he's degenerating and dying, is happening to Scrooge spiritually as well. In other words, we're seeing 2 children die here, little Tim by the hearth, as it were, and that little boy in the abandoned classroom. They're both wasting away if something is not done that revitalizes and rejuvenates and regenerates life back into a fallen world. And of course, that means, so Scrooge ends up asking the spirit if Tiny Tim will live, and the spirit lets him know that if things remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. And that becomes a stunning impact on Scrooge. And because, again, I think the spirit is talking about 2 children. He's not just talking about little Tiny Tim. He's also talking about that little boy in the classroom. They're both going to die, one physically and the other one eternally, spiritually. And so then Ebenezer peers into the home of his nephew Fred, and it's filled with laughter and Christmas cheer, fun and games. He gets involved with it. Ebenezer can't help it. Of course, he's invisible. Nobody sees him through this whole process, right? But he's playing around with them in their games. There's a fellow by the name of Topper who's cheating playfully as they're playing blind man's buff. He's looking through. He found a way of being able to look through the handkerchief, as it were. And so he grabs this woman that he's falling in love with, and he actually proposes to her and puts a ring on her finger. So you even get this idea of a marriage feast, a marriage banquet that we read about at the end of the book of Revelation. And then as the bell strikes 12, Ebenezer encounters the spirit he most dreaded, which is the Phantom. That's the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And Scrooge meets immediately people talking on the street about someone who recently died, but they were so happy. And there wasn't the slightest sense of compassion. They were basically like, good riddance, and the world's better without him. And Scrooge just can't believe people would talk about someone who just died that way. Well, we know who it turns out to be, right? And then he goes to Cratchit's home, and it turns out that Tiny Tim has passed away. And then we read here that one of his siblings reads aloud from Mark chapter 9. He took a child and set him down in the midst of them. And though grief-stricken, the family pledges never to quarrel again. This is the way Bob Cratchit wanted to honor his son, is because he suffered so much, but never, ever complained. We too shall never complain. We shall never quarrel as a family. And at the end, he said, I'm so happy and so blessed to have you with me. And Scrooge is stunned at the power, the enduring power of love, even beyond the grave. And then finally, Scrooge is confronted with his own mortality. And the narrator tells us he's brought to a graveyard. And the spirit, this phantom, where he's actually called the ghost, conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet. And as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, and nowhere was he to be seen. And then when they reached the graveyard, he sees his own grave. He realizes that he was the one who died, that everyone celebrated and was glad what was gone. And then he realized the most horrific irony of all ironies. He realized that very moment that he himself right there had become the ghost. He was now a ghost officially in that Christmas future. And before his own gravesite, he fell on the ground on his knees and he cried out this: "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone." And so, of course, I just love that phrase, by the way, let me sponge away the right. Again, it's sort of baptismal imagery, I think, there. And so Ebenezer's imploring his herd. He wakes up and finds himself in his own bedroom. And unbeknownst to him, it's Christmas morning. And he even says it. He says, "I don't know what day it is." He's so happy. He's so giddy. "I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything." And then he says, "I am quite the baby. I feel like such a baby." And with these words, we now find out that we're privy to two births on Christmas morning. We now know that the death motif that sets up the carol and stalks it all the way through to this moment is broken through with the breaking in of Easter in the midst of Christmas. Christ is born, and the death of Tiny Tim is in fact reversed. And in between those two events is the birth. There's two events of birth and resurrection is Scrooge's rebirth in his own return from the grave. So Ebenezer experiences a conflation of both Christmas and Easter in one and the same day. And hence the gloom of the past night has been completely dispelled. When he opens up the shutters, we're told that the beams of Christmas morning light flood his bedroom, and he cries out, "Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells, oh glorious, glorious." And of course, what follows then for both Tiny Tim and Ebenezer is their feasting in a great banquet. Ebenezer supplies the banquet for Tiny Tim with the big, massive turkey in the poulterer's window. And as for Ebenezer, his journey towards supper, we're told, consisted of him forgiving debts of all the people who owed him money, giving to the poor, and we're told he attended church, blessing and singing to God. And finally, he approached the home of Fred and knocked on his door and asked if he could come in and have dinner. And Fred just flipped out. He said, "Why, bless my soul, who's that?" And he says, "It's I, it's your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you have me, Fred? Will you let me in?" And then we're told, let him in. It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge was home in 5 minutes. And that is the story of A Christmas Carol. We're told in the end that Ebenezer has finally come home.